Cris Beam, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I am really happy to have you here because I've been reading your book, this wonderful book, I Feel You, The Surprising Power of Extreme Empathy. And I have to say, extreme empathy, I'm wondering if your publisher insisted on that term.
Yeah, they did. You know, at first we had a couple of different titles. It was Journey to the Outer Reaches of Empathy, which I liked more, actually. Yeah. And because I think the book is really a sort of travelogue, it's more of a journey through a number of different kinds of empathy.
Yeah, exactly.
But the publisher thought that extreme empathy was a title that would sell because we have extreme everything, I think. We have extreme sports, we have extreme, you know, everything's extreme. So that's, I think, why they picked it. I'm not sure. I mean, do you think that there's extreme empathy in this book?
I suppose one could make that case, but there's a lot of ambivalence about empathy in a way. And,
exactly.
So it's less on the extreme end than on the sort of careful evaluation of empathy. So that's kind of partly how I could recognize right away, oh, this is, you know, the publisher's marketing. It's not unusual when I do these interviews.
Yeah, exactly.
You can just tell this was not the author's title. This was
we don't have any control.
Title.
We don't have control over the book cover or the book title. That's out of our hands. Everything within the book is mine, but everything on the outside and the packaging isn't mine.
Well, I'll tell you what's inside the book is wonderful and it's precious, and I'm going to recommend it strongly to my listeners. Now, you know, this book has it's so deep. It's very deep. It's clear that you're in New York, right? Are you kind of a New York person? Yeah. So it has the ring of a New York intellectual. I mean that in the best possible way throughout the book. And at the same time, it's wide-ranging. As you say, it's almost like a travel log in a way. It's a travel log of your life and of your working this topic of empathy. And it is also very self-revealing in terms of some of the actual issues in your life and some of the struggles that both preceded the book and that are going on in your life even as you're doing the book.
Right.
And, you know, so I'm a psychologist and my listeners are interested in psychology. So of course, that's an area that I'd love to focus on. And you're no stranger to things psychological because, and take us through that a little bit.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I thought a lot about the psychological angle of this book. You know, at first I thought when I was writing this book, I thought a lot about self-empathy because I didn't want to touch it when I first started the book. I thought self-empathy was something that was selfish. I thought it was one more chain in the long chain of selfishness that America sort of espouses. And I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to have to think about it. But I knew that I was going to have to in this book at some point. And then I found myself in a relationship that turned abusive. And suddenly all my old tools, which were to just work hard and put my nose to the grindstone, were no longer working. And I had to think about new ways of managing. And one of the tools that I found worked best was to employ self-empathy. And I took some courses in it and I learned about it. And I realized that having empathy for the self allowed me to move through a lot of pain and trauma.
Yeah. The other thing that is kind of a hallmark of the book is you work very hard to be honest and to be transparent. And so I think that's how so much of your life gets into this. And I hope you won't mind my mentioning some of the things that really leapt out at me to make it such a challenging project for you. You share that your mother was psychotic. Right. And so, you know, that's a huge thing to grow up with and to kind of find your boundaries and where you are. So that was kind of a huge thing in your background. Um, you are a lifelong lesbian. And in the course of that, you became involved with a woman who transitioned gender-wise into male. And that becomes a very important part of the story. And to complicate things, that person's a psychologist, psychotherapist, and you're no stranger to psychotherapy. And thank God, with everything that's going on here, you met somebody.
I need a lot of help.
Yeah. And the key thing is that you were willing to go out and get that help. So you're no stranger to psychotherapy, different schools of psychotherapy, approaches, and all of that. So that's all important background that I wanted my listeners to be aware of. One thing that I wasn't clear on was, did you, at the beginning of your relationship with Seth, this partner who became so abusive, who started out as a woman, was she, and I know that you're not keen on, what's the term, the male-female thing, the hard lines that our culture tends to draw. Yeah. So was Seth female identified when you met her and began the relationship, or she was already in transition?
Seth was never identified as either female or male. So Seth never felt like a female. Seth never felt like a woman ever in his life. So Seth always identified as nothing, and then felt really pushed by the world to pick. It's very hard to live in this binary world, and insist on being neither, because you're always told in the locker room, you're told at the airport, you're told in your university, you're told in your job, you're told at the deli, you're told everywhere that you go to pick. And so finally in his 50s, he said, all right, fine, I'm just going to transition. But it was no surprise. It wasn't like I had been with a woman and then suddenly she transitioned into a man. It wasn't like it wasn't like a lateral transition. It was more like an internal blooming of something that had always been sort of latent and emerged more fully.
So how about well, I guess you'd already written a book. By that time, had you already written a book on transgender teens?
Yes, and I have a transgender daughter.
Okay.
So I'm pretty in the trans community and feel pretty comfortable with that. So Seth's transition was not surprising or difficult. The transition itself was not a shock. What was shocking, I guess, was the way that sort of the world at large started treating us. We started getting better tables at restaurants. You know, we all of a sudden I started being treated as, you know, more feminine. He started getting the checks. You know, I was, all my life I had sort of fought for these hard-won sort of my identity as a lesbian, and then I felt strange being seen as this straight woman because we were marked that way, and so I had to struggle a little bit with that. But as far as our interpersonal relationship, that wasn't hard.
Yeah. Well, this topic is so meaty and so interesting that, you know, maybe we can have another interview down the line about that. But when I picked up this book and started to read it, I thought I was going to be finding about empathy, and I did, but I found out a lot more. So I think all of that stuff maybe deserves another interview. So sometime after this, you can let me know if that's something that you'd like to do.
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the things that comes out in the book, and that you make a strong statement about, is empathy is not just one thing.
Right.
I think I always thought empathy was just, you know, being able to identify with another person, put yourself in their shoes,
Right.
You know.
It's so interesting. When I started doing the research, it was, you know, we think sort of pre-theory that empathy is just standing in another person's shoes, but even that needs to be broken down a little bit, because if you think, you know, standing in another person's shoes, there's the first idea of how it's an imaginative exercise, right? It's imagining what would it feel for me to experience what you experience, that's A, or B, how would it feel for you to experience what you're experiencing? And both of those are a little bit troubling, because with A, I'm not really imagining you, where I'm trying to imagine what it's like for me to experience what you're experiencing, right? That's a little bit, that's a mess. And then B, for you to experience what you're experiencing, I'm sort of swallowing up your agency. I'm co-opting you. So both are troubling, both have problems. So I started looking for other definitions, and there's a person named Nell Noddings who says, you know, the whole notion of projecting yourself into another person's experience is a very Western masculine notion of empathy. And she says that the core essence of empathy is merely receptivity, and a kind of mutual receptivity. And it's not about projecting or imagining at all. And so I started thinking a lot about that, and whether we could just have empathy by being receptive. So there's that.
It's interesting you use the word mutual. If
right.
if I'm going to be empathetic towards you, it can't just be a one-way thing. It's got to be a sort of mutual dance.
Yeah, it does have to be a kind of mutual dance. For there to be real understanding, both parties have to be participating in it.
Yeah. Now, of course, one of the sort of neuropsychological breakthroughs of recent years has been the whole discovery of mirror neurons, or
right.
what you also refer to in the book of the Gandhi, as after Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah.
I'd
Gandhi
never heard
neurons.
them, the Gandhi neurons.
Yeah.
So how does that jibe with what you were just saying?
Well,
and maybe it doesn't, because there are a lot of contradictions in here.
Yeah, the mirror neurons are interesting because mirror neurons were discovered by Giacomo Rizzolatti in the 90s. And Rizzolatti discovered that for listeners that don't remember or don't know about them, they're the neurons that fire in the motor region of the brain. And they fire when a monkey, they've only been found in monkeys and weirdly sparrows, because we can only stick the probes into beings that we can take off part of the skull. So we haven't discovered them directly in humans. We can do
I
fMRI.
didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, for humans, we can do fMRI studies and see that the brain lights up in these regions, but we can't probe directly into the neurons themselves and do the exact same study. We can't replicate it at that level. So with the mirror neurons, what happens is a monkey witnesses another monkey moving, and their own movement neurons fire as well, as though they were doing the movement. And so what they said was, wow, this is empathy. This is how empathy works. When we experience another person moving, it's like we're moving ourselves without actually moving a muscle. And it triggered a whole avalanche of studies and interest in all things empathy. And so that was the really interesting thing, was the avalanche. Ultimately, what people said was, wait a minute, we don't know that that's empathy. All we know is that the neurons are firing. We don't know that it's action understanding. We don't know that a kind of understanding is happening. All we know is that it's firing. So ultimately—
That's an interesting distinction.
Yeah.
So in other words, there's maybe stuff going on, but maybe there's not that real sort of in-depth taking in and
right. There's not a comprehension going on. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so there was a leap that was made that people said, slow down, we're not so sure. But what happened was all of these studies started coming out where people started looking at empathy in literature, empathy in dance, empathy in business, empathy in anger, empathy in everything. And outside of it, it started jumping outside of the neuroscience labs. And so it started a real interest in all things empathy, which sort of launched this burgeoning field. And all of a sudden, empathy was in the water. And so that's what became really interesting.
Yeah, you say that you start the book out sort of saying that other people are saying that we're going through an empathy boom, if you will.
Yeah.
And you kind of question that as you go along in the book.
Yeah, I do. You know, I think it's interesting. From what I can research, it looks like every 100 years or so we get these surges. Like right now, we're really interested in empathy because of this neuroscience boom that started this latest trigger. But 100 years ago, the word empathy came about. It was the word in German was the word Einfühlung, which means feeling into, and it was translated into the word empathy. And it was it was an aesthetic concept originally, and it means it means feeling into, and it's the way that you look at art. And the idea is that you feel your way into art. Say you're looking at your computer screen, and rather than just looking at it and thinking about it, you feel a kind of empathy with it. You feel the flatness of it internally in your body. And this idea of feeling into influenced thinkers like Freud and others who said, hey, wait a minute, that's what we do with people. We intuitively, instinctively, sort of instantaneously feel our way into them. We don't intellectually do it, we feel it.
Yeah.
And so that was what was happening 100 years ago. And then after that, there was a sort of switch away from that, a pendulum swing away from that, with a lot of thinkers that started saying, no, we're actually not so connected. We're not so interconnected. We're more like independent and not so interdependent. We're more independent. And now we're back on the pendulum swing that says we're actually interdependent and empathy matters. So, and this happened again 200 years ago with thinkers like Smith and Hume, who talked about sympathy. And then there was a swing away from it with thinkers like Rousseau and his Savage Man, who said, no, we're actually independent. We're not interdependent. So we go on these swings every 50 years.
Yeah.
Say they're independent or interdependent. And
Yeah.
we're just, so right now we're kind of on empathy swing in intellectual circles that say that we're interdependent. Now, if you take another look at culture, you could say we're not empathic at all. We've got a president that has to, have cue cards that tell him how to be empathic. So you could say, if you look at culture from a top-down perspective, you could say we're not empathic one bit. So it's really hard to tell from a meta level whether we're actually more empathic, but there are a lot of studies. There is a lot of interest. We're teaching empathy in the schools. There's a lot of cultural empathy going on.
Yeah. One wild thought that came to mind, I know you're a teacher. Have you ever noticed that there'll be some students out there that are mouthing what you're saying? You'll see their lips will be, and in a way, it's, you might think, well, wow, their Gandhi neurons are really working overtime. Yeah. And then we have to wonder, well, are they, what's going on with that? Are they so caught up with you? Are they so identified? You have any ideas about that?
That's mirroring, and that's considered a kind of low-level empathy, where somebody is literally just mirroring what you're doing. A higher level empathy is the kind of empathy that is where somebody takes sort of the imaginative leap and actually feels what you're feeling rather than just mirroring what you're doing. Babies mirror right out of the womb. Babies will cry when another baby cries. They'll stick out their tongue when you stick out your tongue. So that's mirroring. That's just very human instinct. But, we develop as we grow. Like by age 2, we're able to imagine what we're able to feel what another person feels, but we expect them to need what we need. So that's why you'll have like a toddler, when you cry, hand you their stuffy. you know, because they think that your feelings are like their feelings. By
Yeah.
age 4, we can start to imagine that somebody's feelings are different from our own feelings.
Yeah. And that's the
So
beginning of what they call theory of mind, right?
that's exactly theory of mind.
Yeah,
So you can
yeah,
recognize that somebody else's experience is different than
yeah,
your experience. And
yeah.
at age 4 is interesting. That's when we begin to lie. You don't usually start to lie until around 4. And that's when you realize, oh, I can get away with something because I can think something different than what mommy thinks.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, it strikes me too is when I first read this, I feel you, that's sort of very much into African-American vocabulary, right?
Yeah, a lot of cultures say I feel you, but yeah,
Really? Yeah, I
yeah.
feel, I don't know how that got into the African-American thing. It wasn't always there, but
It's a very urban saying, I feel you.
I feel you. Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
feel you.
Okay. And as when you were talking about the ability to appreciate art as a kind of empathy, um, there's real individual differences on that, right? There's a whole scale, like most human traits and experiences, you know, with the bell curve and all, that we vary from person to person, to people who have looks like zero capacity to do that with art, and people who are on the extremely sensitive to the finest nuances, whether it be in music or theater or
Yeah, that's
literature.
interesting. You know, some of that, you know, when we talk about can empathy be learned, I think that it, 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 it can't necessarily be taught, but it can be modeled, and art comes into that. The more exposure that you have to art, the more you're going to learn to empathize with art. You're going to, and that's how we learn empathy, is we've always learned empathy through art. So when we talk about creating a curriculum that teaches empathy, I think one of the best ways to do it is through art, because that's where we feel. We feel through literature, we feel through art, we feel through dance, we feel through these things. And so we need exposure to these things to begin to tune up the volume on our
Yeah,
feeling. So people that supposedly don't feel through art, it may be a lack of exposure, it may be a whole host of things, but it may be
sure.
that the art doesn't resonate with them culturally. But you know, there are a lot of reasons that people might not feel so much through art.
Yeah, sure, sure. Not only the exposure, but also the kind of exposure they got. Were their parents super excited about it, and
Right.
did that get
Yeah.
communicated somehow, or
Yeah.
were their friends into it? And
Yeah.
just to give people a little bit of a overview of, we're kind of touching on the material and skipping around that's in your book. You decided to explore empathy in 5 different venues, if you will. Science labs, and you went to some science labs,
Yeah.
and people who are doing the science studies about empathy, and elementary education settings,
Yeah.
and you went to into arts. You looked into theater approaches and so on, and then you go to the justice system, and where is empathy in the justice system, and then you go into forgiveness programs such as those in South Africa. And I didn't realize that there's a big forgiveness program in the state of Maine that you
Yeah.
go into.
Brilliant.
So, yeah, so there was this, going back to, you described this as a travel, as a journey. And so
Yeah.
those are the different venues that you journeyed to. Who, you know, who would have thought that one would approach it in this way? But that is how you approached it.
It
And
is.
and what you discovered in the process is a lot of complexity that
Yeah. Yeah. It was much more complex than I thought. And it was really interesting to travel. Like, for example, when I was in South Africa, one of the ideas that I really came up against was this idea of empathy as an interruption of power, which was a whole new idea and way of thinking about empathy. And I had never considered empathy as an interruption of power, but I was there during a time when they were releasing Eugene de Kock, who was the the head of Lakplace, which was the apartheid prison, and he was being released on parole. And that would never happen here in the United States. Somebody that was a prime, they call him prime evil in South Africa. Somebody that had committed such gross crimes against humanity was being released on parole, partly because he had shown remorse and helped his victims find the bodies, and partly because the idea was that if he were out of prison, showing empathy for him was a way to reduce the power that he had. Empathy was a way of interrupting his power because it stopped him from being the one bad apple and made everybody complicit. And it was a very interesting idea that we don't have, where we like to demonize our bad guys and say they're the bad ones, we're the good ones, and that's how it works and that's how it's settled. And in South Africa, I found there was a lot of discussion around how did we all create this system, and how are we all complicit, and how do we have a discussion around that? And that was a very interesting
blacks and whites alike.
Absolutely.
We're all complicit on both sides of this issue.
I mean, whites more. We're talking about whites being complicit in the construction of apartheid, but because he was a white apartheid activist. But you know, the idea of him being in prison was allowed other people who were complicit in the architecture of apartheid to sort of go free, so to speak. So they wanted to bring him out and have that dialogue around what else has everybody else done, which was a very interesting idea of empathy, having empathy for him as a way to bring about dialogue. Yeah,
okay. Well, since we're talking about this, let's go to the example in Maine, where you discovered that there was a work on reconciliation between Native Americans and whites in Maine, right? Do I have that right?
Yes, absolutely. So in Maine, there are 5 Wabanaki tribes, and they decided to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sort of like the one in South Africa. But the idea was that, you know, I'll back up a little bit. In 1973, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed. And what it said was that Native kids could no longer be placed with white families. Native kids were being taken from their homes and placed with white families, and yanked from their homes and stolen from their homes. And this was, unfortunately, this was happening in Maine way past ICWA, way past the Indian Child Welfare Act date, up into the 80s. And so there was a lot of anger, a lot of pain, a lot of trauma around this. And they said, let's create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission wherein we talk with the Native families and the government bodies that did this, the social welfare, the social workers and the government bodies, and have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and say, how did this happen? What happened? And try to create some dialogue and some empathy. And what they found was, as they began to dialogue around it, was that they couldn't just go back through the 80s and the 70s when the actual removals took place. They had to go much further back. They had to go way back toward the original, genocides, to colonization, and say, look, this trauma goes deep, and we've got to involve the whole state of Maine. We can't just, this is not just about, I mean, much like South Africa, this is not just about a few bad apples. This is about a whole systemic kind of racism that has existed. And so what they decided to do was set up sort of talking commissions where anybody could talk, and the Native tribes had sort of private talking sessions where they would meet in groups and privately and talk to one another. So they didn't face off in the same way that TRCs did in South Africa, where perpetrators and victims would go head to head. They did it privately so that people would feel safer. And then they did a whole series of education campaigns where they educated both sides about what had happened and the trauma that had existed going back into the 18th century. I'm sorry, the 15th century, going all the way back to colonization. And then tracking it forward and looking at how we built up to these removals happening. And it was a very, very beautiful process.
Wow. Yeah, this is sort of a new idea that's emerged fairly recently, I think, in psychology, is recognizing generational trauma.
Yeah.
That it's not, you know, that it can, it affects the children and the grandchildren and the grandchildren of the grandchildren.
Exactly. And that's what they found when they started doing this TRC work, was that they couldn't just talk to the immediate victims of this, is that they had this kind of trauma had gone back generations upon generations upon generations, and to actually do the healing work, they would have to talk about that and do a real education campaign around it. So I think you're right, it is generational trauma.
Yeah, so we can see that empathy plays a key role here, because it requires some kind of empathy, however you define it, right? To care enough to go through that process, to be willing to take responsibility, own the pain,
Right.
own some of the burden for it ever having happened, even though it happened before you were born.
Yeah, and it was interesting because
that's extreme empathy, I would say.
That's extreme empathy, yeah. And it was interesting because when I was talking with some of the Native elders about the listening campaigns, where they were listening to people's stories about what had happened to them, they said that they couldn't necessarily do talking sessions where Native people talked to the white people because the listening styles were so different. And they said that the listening style in Native communities with the talking stick and so forth was to listen with a kind of, I'm listening to you and I hear the goodness in you and I see the goodness in you. And it's not a kind of, that's a very different notion of empathy than the one that we traditionally think of, which is I'm listening to you and I'm imagining how I would experience your pain. That's a very different kind of thing, to listen and just imagine the goodness in you. And I tried it so much to just listen to people and imagine the goodness in them. And it's so sort of anathema to the way that we're trained to listen, you know, just to listen and hear the goodness in someone. So they had to do their own healing and hearing listening sessions because it was so different from the way the white people were doing it.
Well, how was it for you when you tried it on? I mean, a gutsy New Yorker, you know, with all the hard edges that come with that.
Yeah, it's not natural to me. It's not natural. Right. It's more natural for me to, you know, we're so trained to bring it back to the self continually. Like, how would I feel? How would I feel? How would I feel? And to not do that, to try to just say, I'm listening to you and imagining you as a good person is really hard. Try it sometime. I'm not good at it. I think it takes training. It takes deep training.
I think when we hear other people's stories, though, doesn't that tend to evoke that in us? In other words, just getting people down to talking about the personal things in their lives begins to open up that space, doesn't it?
Yeah, maybe it does. Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
Just to imagine the goodness. Yeah. It's hard though, because we come with so many preconceived judgments that as soon as somebody does, you know, we get caught up in the details. As soon as somebody does starts telling a story that feels like something that we would never do, we start to judge and say, oh, I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that experience. And so one way that I learned about listening too was to identify with the feelings the person is talking about rather than the details of the story that the person is talking about. So if someone is telling a story about the time that they robbed a bank, I mean, this is a ridiculous story idea, but that they robbed someone, and you think, well, I would never rob someone. I can't relate to that at all. But you can relate to the feeling of being desperate. So that's a way to empathize. You can relate to the feeling of being scared.
It's also, I think, a way that therapists hopefully are trained to listen as well.
Interesting. How do you listen that way?
To not listen to the details, not to get caught up in the details of the story, as you were saying, because that can go on endlessly. We've always got a story and can just go on and talk about our story. So part of the task of the therapist is to not get distracted by all of that and to be listening to the emotional core.
Interesting. Yeah. And try to relate to that emotional core. Yeah, that's something that we worked on a lot. I think one of the classes that I took was in nonviolent communication and empathic listening there. And one of the things that they do is you listen to what somebody's saying, and then underneath it, you listen to what are the needs beneath that. So that's the training that they do, is what do I hear you saying, and then what do I think the needs are. So that's another way.
And there's another, I don't know if this is part of the same discussion, but there's another place where you're talking to at least one person who is advocating it's not enough just to know what the needs are, but you have to go on to try do your best to fill those needs, right? Does this ring a bell? There's this guy that you profile who starts trying to launch a national movement.
Right. Yeah, there's a guy in California who's trying to launch an empathy movement. And he thinks we should have an empathy party. He says we shouldn't be Democrats or Republicans. We should just have an empathy party, which to me feels a little bit of a stretch, but we could try. But empathy in itself is just listening and understanding someone. Compassion or sympathy are taking action. So that's where the definition stretches into actually moving into wanting to help someone. Empathy is just the precursor for that.
Yeah. You went to a couple of different elementary school programs. How did you happen to choose these two programs, and what did you see and learn?
So I was really interested in finding out about school programs because we're seeing more and more schools with empathy curriculum. In general, part of this is the push for anti-bullying campaigns. 49 states now have anti-bullying mandates, and so they're part of what they're doing is they're teaching empathy as a curricular corrective to that. And part of this is a corporate push that corporations are pushing the schools to teach empathy because they think they need empathic workers, which is a whole other story. But there's a real push for schools to teach empathy. So I was really interested in why and how schools are teaching it. And one of the things that I saw that was really interesting is a program that's out of Canada called Roots of Empathy. And what they do is they bring, and this is just starting to make its way, it's all through Canada, it's a little bit in Europe, and it's just starting to make its way into the US. And Roots of Empathy is a program wherein they model empathy by bringing in a baby into a classroom. And it's the same baby for 9 months, and it's the baby and its caregiver. And they bring the baby in every 2 weeks, and the same class watches the same baby, and they watch what happens with the baby. If the baby is crying, they talk about the baby crying. If the baby is teething, they talk about the baby teething, and they get to watch this baby grow. And the idea isn't so much that they feel what the baby feels, but they're developing a sort of emotional vocabulary. So when the baby feels sad, it's sort of a safe place to talk about their own sad feelings. It's a lot safer for them to talk about sadness with something sort of neutral or safe like a baby than it is for them to talk about sadness necessarily with their own, if another kid in the room feels sad.
What sort of student population is this? Is it a minority population? Is it
they do it in all schools.
Kids?
They do it in all schools. They're doing it in private schools and public schools. The school that I witnessed it in was a pretty poor school in Washington, D.C.'s 8th Ward. So it was a pretty poor school. And it was a boys' school, so it was a magnet school for all boys.
Wow.
And they were in 4th grade, and they loved their baby. I mean, they were really into her, and they sing a little song to her when she comes in, and then she just like tools around on the floor, and they talk about what they think she's feeling, and they project all kinds of stuff onto her. Like, I think she needs this. I think she needs a book. I mean, she's like 9 months old, and they're like, I think she needs a book. Well, maybe they need a book. So then they can talk about what they feel about books and why they need books. And, you know, it gives them a chance to talk about their needs and feelings. And
So the teacher would have to provide some skilled guidance around all that too.
Yes. So there's
to make use of it.
Yes. There's a really fat lesson plan that goes along with each class. So the teacher is really skilled at guiding the discussion. So what, what feels like sort of loose lips chatter is really actually very directed guidance. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm now remembering another personal thing that you shared, which is really right on point, talking about empathy, where you were attacked by a gang of teens. Was it Halloween?
It was Halloween.
Yeah, because they were in masks and costumes, which I think because people are sort of hidden, it can really release inner demons, if you will. It invites acting out, because I've been at some Halloween parties where I've seen that dynamic that people get very, very weird when they're in a mask.
Yeah, they really feel the right or the excuse to behave badly.
Yeah, and to me, it illustrates a sort of Jungian psychodynamic principle: that which conceals reveals.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. But I was struck by your response. They were beating you up, injuring you, calling you names, and yet you felt empathy for them. Tell us about that. And how was that possible?
Halloween, and this was some years ago, and I was standing on a subway platform, and these kids got off the subway, and they mobbed me, and they jumped me, and they called me a dyke, and they bashed my head against a wall, and they were beating me up, and then they ran from me, and they yelled, "It's really bleeding, it's really bleeding." And I thought, like I was reduced to an and it was so shocking. And I was lying there, and I was bleeding, and I thought, those kids could be my students, you know, they were high school kids. And I thought—
And you were teaching high school kids at the time.
Yeah. And I thought, I was teaching college at the time, but I had taught high school previously. Okay. And I thought, you know, any of those kids could have been my students, you know, recently. And what I wanted to do was, you know, when the cops came, they wanted me to profile them. They wanted to know, you know, what they looked like. And of course I didn't know. They were all in Halloween costumes. They were all in masks and capes, and, you know, I had no idea what they looked like. Plus it was such a blur. It was all fast and traumatic, and I didn't know what was happening. But I was really angry at the cops for, you know, they immediately went into racial profiling, and I was upset by that. And I didn't want them, they wanted to get them, you know, and I didn't want them to be punished. What I wanted, interestingly, was to talk to them. I wanted to yell at them. I wanted them to feel what it felt like to be dehumanized. I wanted to say to them, I wanted to get them into a room, actually one-on-one, and say, do you know what it feels like to be called it? Have you ever been called an it? I wanted them to feel what I felt. And I thought about that for a long time, and it made me think about restitution programs where, you know, victims get to talk to their perpetrators and actually work out. And that's why I think victim victim restitution programs are actually on the rise because a lot of people feel like this. They don't necessarily want their perpetrator to go sit in a cage or to pay a fine. They want some kind of justice, which is to feel better. They want to feel like, why did you do this? How could you have done this to me? It feels personal. It feels like I'm a human being, you're a human being. How could you, a human being, have done this to me, a human being? And that's what we want to figure out, because otherwise the world feels too scary.
We've been seeing some of that in is it the Bill Cosby trial, where he had to sit and listen to the women that he had offended? And it was very painful. He didn't want to do that.
Right, exactly. And yet the women had this need to say, you did this, I want to face my accuser. We have this need to face our accusers. We want to face our perpetrators. We want to face them. We want to talk to them. We want to say, you harmed me. How could you have done this? It's a very human, very base need to be seen, to be recognized, because to be attacked is so dehumanizing. We have the need to right it. And I think that that's a very primal form of empathy.
And somewhere in this empathy conversation, it seems to me that there is a dynamic of forgiveness as well when we talk about in the legal examples that you give. Do you find that forgiveness is part of this empathy conversation?
I do. I think that empathy is a precursor to forgiveness. I think that empathy is a precursor to remorse. I think that to really be able to forgive someone, the other person has to show remorse. And to be able to show remorse, you have to be able to see the other person. You have to see them as human, and you have to be able to show remorse for them. And then forgiveness can happen. And it's interesting, in our court system, we only have guilt, and we only have guilt, and we don't have a place for remorse and forgiveness. And I think that that's a real tragedy. It's interesting. There's something called the Apology Project that I've been reading about, which is actual perpetrators who have set this up to try to reach out to their victims and show remorse and apologize and see if they can set up a dialogue, because they feel like they need to work out something. And if the victims are amenable to it, they will set up some kind of dialogue. Because it's a very human instinct to want to do it, and the courts don't set this up. There are victim response statements, but they're usually said after the whole court process has gone through, and it's done at the very, very end, and it's not a dialogue. And mostly what we want is some kind of dialogue.
This is reminding me of the chapters that you wrote about that in Red Hook. Is that in New York? Where's Red Hook?
Red Hook Community Court, yes.
Okay, so there were two different there were two different courts.
Yes.
Tell us about those two courts.
So one is Red Hook Community Court, and one is the Human Trafficking Intervention Court. So Red Hook.
Yes.
Yes. So Red Hook Community Court is really interesting because it's the judge there has made himself a justice that can oversee family court trials and criminal court cases and juvenile cases. And that's very rare. He's the only one in the country that can do that. Mostly these cases are tried in separate courtrooms. And in reality, the people that are court involved are often multiply court involved. So, if somebody is having problems with housing court, their kids are often then missing school and are going to juvenile court or family court. And if they're going to juvenile court, then they're often going to, they're getting multiply involved. And so what he can do is he can oversee the whole picture and say, oh, there's a problem in the family. The dad isn't working, and so the mom is stealing, and so the kids are missing school, and so the problem is we need to get some housing support for this family, and that'll solve the big problem, instead of sending them to all these different courts and just finding them and sending them to jail all the time.
Sounds like something that might have happened in indigenous communities where a wise person or an elder would settle issues within the tribal group by having that whole context.
It just makes logical sense to say, let's look at the big picture, what's going on, and solve it from sort of a humanistic and meta kind of logical viewpoint, rather than going, you committed this one crime, let's fix it. You committed this other crime, let's fine it. You committed this other crime, let's send you to jail. Let's look at what the root problem is. And that's a very empathic way of dealing with it. So it's a very beautiful court system, and could be a model for other ways of handling problems.
And yet there would be tremendous resistance because I think there are a lot of people who would be inclined in that direction. It's a sort of a liberal versus not a liberal kind of thing, right? Of people who feel like, no, they need to be punished. None of all this liberal wishy-washy stuff.
Right.
That's
I know. People feel like you committed a crime, do the time for your crime, But so often the crime is rooted in a deeper problem. And so if you can deal with the problem, you can deal with the crime. So
that takes us to the sex trafficking or the sex worker court, where go ahead and tell us about that, because the situation that these women found themselves in tended to push them in that direction.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So in New York State 5 years ago, they changed the law so that anybody that's arrested for prostitution gets sent automatically to these human trafficking intervention courts. So you're still arrested, you're still interfacing with the police, it's still a crime for prostitution. But once you make it to court, you're sent to a different court, and it's modeled after the drug courts or the domestic violence courts, where instead of doing time or getting a fine, you are given services. So it sounds like a better situation. The person that started it was this guy, Fernando Camacho, who started seeing repeat offenders. He kept, giving these girls, usually young girls, time, and then they'd get out of jail, and then they'd be back in his courtroom. And he was like, something is wrong here. We've got to find some way to help them get out of the life. Those were his terms. Let's help them get out of the life. And so instead of giving them sentences or fines, he started to give them services. So GED services, counseling, immigration services, those kinds of things. And then the court was so successful, they said, well, this is a really empathic way to deal with these sex workers or these prostitutes. Let's make this the statewide standard. The trouble is, not everyone is trafficked. So they're treating everybody as though they're being trafficked, and they're not. Not everyone who comes into the court system is there because they're being pimp controlled. They're there because they want to be doing sex work. And so treating everyone, this is where empathy can falter, where you sort of treat everyone, you paint everyone with the same broad brush. Or
give everybody the same solution, one solution for all.
Exactly. So this is a problem. So some of the youth that come in there really need the services, and they are being trafficked. There are 100,000 kids a year that are trafficked that are sex trafficked, and they really need the help. But then there are sex workers who are doing this voluntarily and are proud of their work and shouldn't be, treated as though they're being trafficked. So this is where empathy can take on a sort of patronizing tone and needs to be sort of judged or looked at carefully.
Yeah, one of the other things I remember about this that emerged was housing is such a big issue for people in the life that, because they don't have stable housing, They're kind of driven to that life. And for some people, that's a, quotes, easy fix.
Right, exactly. So if you really, the idea is if you really want to help people, give them this, it's not about giving them 6 sessions of counseling. It's about helping them to get housing so that they're not doing this sort of work. And then you'll really be helping people. So it's like, they're kind of not fixing it, and they're not fixing the issue of the police intervention, because the police are they're still having to interface with the police, which can mean raids, which can mean spending the night in a tank. It can mean all these things that can be violent and scary. Yeah. So it's not a perfect fix.
You know, as an older male, it's a little side trip here. As an older male, I'm experiencing a certain amount of urinary frequency, and I had to I had to drive down to Vallejo, which is an hour or 2 away from here. And I find that I'm limited now in terms of travel because if it's a long car trip, I'm going to have to take a leak. I'm going to have to stop off somewhere.
Right.
Well,
right.
I was going to a place to be interviewed by a TV production company for an interview. So I was like eager to get there, was careful not to drink any coffee before I went, just had minimal liquids, the milk in my cereal, and, you know, and just a little bit of liquid. And still, by the time I got there, I was dying. I really had to take a leak. And it was kind of a strip mall area. I was going to be interviewed in a Greasy Spoon diner, and that's a whole nother story.
Right.
But the diner wasn't open yet. And so I'm in this sort of strip mall area, and I'm going to the auto parts store and I'm dressed up. So, you know, I look respectable.
Right.
And I went into establishment after establishment asking, do you have a restroom I could use? I am dying. No, we don't, not for public use. And it put me, talk about empathizing. I felt so much empathy for the homeless. It's like, if me as a white-haired, presumably wise-looking, dressed-up guy can't find I'm looking at the sides of houses, I'm looking at bushes, you know, maybe I'm going to have to whip it out here.
Yeah.
God, what must it be like for homeless people just to go to the bathroom?
Right. Just that basic act. I know.
A basic act. And somehow, I guess, to tie this back in, it's got something to do with the way we've constructed our society such that that kind of empathy is in short supply.
Right. It's really true.
When you're in need. Yeah.
It's really true. It's really true. And sometimes it takes certain experiences like that for us to remember, oh my gosh, people like suffering all the time.
Yeah. Just human needs.
Yeah.
When you began this trip, I mean, with your personal history of, you know, starting with the psychotic mother and all the other things that happened to you, I mean, I would say you were somebody who could really use some empathy along the way. Were you aware of that might be a motivating force for your interest in doing a book on empathy? Was that in your conscious mind at all?
About needing empathy?
Yeah.
I don't know. Not necessarily. I think I get a lot. I have a very, very close community of friends. So I do get a lot of empathy. I have a very tight, chosen family. So I feel very supported, and I'm very lucky that way.
Yeah.
So, and I get a lot of therapy. And so I'm very lucky. So I wasn't necessarily looking to figure out how I could be empathized with, but I do feel that empathy helps me. And I know that when it's turned up, it helps others. And so I was interested in how to, in the places where it's being fostered, how we can harness that, because I do think that it does help people.
Where did you get that first whiff of an idea for, I think I'm going to write a book about empathy?
You know, with my other books, I always started from the bottom up. I did a book on transgender street kids. I did a book on foster care, and I started with where I went into community and spent like 5 or 7 years following families very, very closely, and then used those families to think broadly about issues of social justice and racism and poverty and big ideas. With this book, I knew I wanted to start with a big idea and then drop down. So do sort of the opposite. And what I noticed was I kept seeing this word empathy everywhere. And empathy was like on the news, and empathy was, you know, in magazines. Empathy was being talked about in the schools. And after I wrote the foster care book, I saw it being talked about in the courtrooms. And I spent a lot of time in public schools, and I saw it being taught there. And I thought, why is empathy being talked about so much? And should we be suspicious of it? And so I just got really curious about empathy, and I wanted to study it.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, you're very open about your suspiciousness that you started out with. By the time we get to the end of the book, there's an afterword, and it's about love.
Yeah.
So we went from skepticism, and we went from interest and skepticism and mixed feelings, and we end up with love. Tell us about love and how that fits in here.
Well, you know, I did move into love, and I do think that my own personal journey through the book moved me into thinking about more and more about love, and that it's like Freud says, it's like all you have is work and love, you know, and ultimately love is what matters, and love is what heals us. And love, I do hope that we're moving culturally more toward love. And
that's the perfect place for us to wrap this interview up, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, thank you.